There are truths you avoid. You see them every day, but you look away. They make you uncomfortable. They demand attention you are not ready to give. They sit in the background of your mind, quietly persistent, never fully disappearing no matter how many distractions you pile on top of them. You know they are there. You have always known, but knowing something and facing it are two very different acts. One requires nothing from you. The other requires everything, and so you choose the easier path. You look the other direction. You fill your hours with noise, with busy work, with anything that keeps your attention moving fast enough that the truth cannot catch up. But it always catches up. Why do we ignore what is staring us in the face? It is not because we are weak. It is not because we lack intelligence or awareness. Most people who avoid uncomfortable truths are sharp enough to recognize them. That is what makes avoidance so strange. You see the thing clearly, you understand its implications, and then, with full awareness, you choose to act as though it does not exist. This is not a failure of perception. It is a failure of willingness. The mind does not resist truth because truth is dangerous. It resists truth because truth is inconvenient. It disrupts the story you have already written about yourself. It challenges the assumptions you have built your decisions on. It asks you to change, and change requires energy, discomfort, and the admission that something you believed or did was wrong. That admission is what most people cannot tolerate. Avoidance is natural. It feels safe. In the moment you turn away from an uncomfortable realization, there is a brief wave of relief. The tension drops. The pressure eases. Your mind rewards you for protecting itself from discomfort. And because that reward is immediate, it trains you to repeat the behavior. But the longer you ignore reality, the more it controls you. Not loudly, not dramatically. It controls you in the quiet accumulation of poor decisions. It controls you in the relationships that slowly deteriorate because you refuse to address what was wrong. It controls you in the career that stagnates because you would not acknowledge what needed to change. It controls you in the health you neglect, the finances you avoid reviewing, the conversations you keep postponing. Every truth you avoid becomes a debt, and like any debt, it grows with time. Some people notice the truth and act differently. They are not superhuman. They are not immune to discomfort. They feel the same resistance, the same pull toward avoidance, the same desire to look away. But somewhere in that process, they make a different choice. They pause. They face it. They use it to make better choices. Not because it feels good. Almost never because it feels good. They do it because they have learned, through repetition, and often through failure, that the cost of avoidance is always higher than the cost of confrontation. By understanding what you avoid and why, you can train your mind to choose clarity over comfort, awareness over autopilot. This is not about becoming fearless. It is about becoming honest with yourself in a way that most people never commit to. And that honesty, practiced consistently, changes everything. The first thing to understand is that your mind is not designed to seek truth. It is designed to seek comfort and safety. These are not the same thing, and confusing them is the root of most avoidance. When something threatens your sense of safety, whether it is a physical threat or an emotional one, your mind activates the same protective response. It wants to move you away from the source of discomfort as quickly as possible. In a physical situation, this is useful. If something is genuinely dangerous, the instinct to withdraw keeps you alive. But most of the truths you avoid are not dangerous. They are just uncomfortable. Your mind does not make that distinction well. It treats the discomfort of realizing you are in the wrong relationship the same way it treats the discomfort of touching a hot surface. It wants you to pull away, and so you do. You pull away from the conversation you need to have. You pull away from the financial reality you need to examine. You pull away from the honest assessment of your habits, your patterns, your choices. And each time you pull away, the avoidance becomes more automatic. This is how avoidance becomes invisible. It stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling like the natural order of things. You do not even notice that you are doing it, because it has become woven into your default behavior. You check your phone when a difficult thought arises. You start a new project when the current one reveals flaws you do not want to address. You change the subject when a conversation gets too close to something real. You busy yourself with tasks that feel productive, but are actually just sophisticated forms of hiding. None of this is obvious while it is happening. That is what makes it effective. The mind is remarkably good at disguising avoidance as something useful. The temporary relief avoidance provides is real. That is important to acknowledge. If avoidance offered nothing, no one would practice it. But it offers something powerful. It removes tension in the short term. And for many people, the short term is the only time frame that feels real. When you avoid an uncomfortable truth, you get to keep your current story intact. You get to maintain the image you have of yourself. You get to continue believing that things are fine, that the problem will resolve itself, that you will deal with it later when you are ready. That feeling of preservation is addictive, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, almost imperceptible way. You become attached to the version of reality where you do not have to change, and every act of avoidance reinforces that attachment. But here is what avoidance cannot do. It cannot stop the truth from being true. The problem you refuse to look at does not pause while you look away. It continues, it develops, it compounds, and when it finally becomes impossible to ignore, it arrives with far more weight than it would have carried if you had addressed it early. This is the hidden arithmetic of avoidance. You trade a small discomfort now for a much larger discomfort later. And because the later discomfort is abstract, distant, and uncertain, it does not carry enough weight to override the relief you feel in the present moment. So you avoid, and the debt grows. Most people do not notice when they are avoiding reality. They believe they are being practical, patient, strategic. They tell themselves that the timing is not right, that they need more information, that the situation might change on its own. These justifications are rarely examined. They sit on the surface of the mind, plausible enough to avoid scrutiny, but thin enough to collapse under honest questioning. If you were to stop and ask yourself, with genuine curiosity, whether your reason for waiting is based on evidence or on discomfort, the answer would usually be clear. But you do not stop and ask, because stopping and asking is itself an act of confrontation, and confrontation is precisely what you are trying to avoid. This creates a loop. Avoidance protects itself by discouraging the very examination that would expose it, and so it continues, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime. There is a specific moment when avoidance begins, and learning to recognize that moment is the single most important skill in this entire process. It happens fast. A thought arises. A realization begins to form. You feel a slight tension in your chest or your stomach. Your mind starts to engage with something real, something honest, something that carries weight. And then, almost immediately, a counter-impulse appears. It pulls your attention away. It offers you something easier to focus on. It redirects you toward a task, a distraction, a rationalization. That redirection is so fast that most people experience it as a single event. They do not feel the truth arise and then feel the avoidance kick in. They just feel the avoidance. The truth barely registers before it is buried. But it is not a single event. It is two events happening in rapid succession. The truth appears first. The avoidance follows, and between those two events there is a gap. It is small, often less than a second, but it is there. That gap is where everything changes. If you can learn to notice that gap, to slow down enough to feel the truth before the avoidance covers it, you gain access to a kind of clarity that most people never experience. Not because it is rare or difficult in theory, but because it requires you to tolerate the very discomfort your mind is trying to protect you from. You have to be willing to sit in that moment of tension without moving, without checking your phone, without changing the subject in your own head, without telling yourself a more comfortable version of what you just noticed. That willingness is not natural. It has to be developed, and it develops slowly through repetition, through practice, through the accumulated experience of facing small truths and discovering that the discomfort, while real, is survivable. The discomfort does not destroy you. That is the discovery most people never make because they never stay long enough to find out. They feel the first wave of tension and they move. They assume the tension will escalate indefinitely. They imagine that facing the truth will lead to collapse, to overwhelm, to some unbearable emotional state they will not be able to recover from. But that almost never happens. What actually happens is that the tension peaks, holds for a moment, and then begins to subside, not because the truth becomes less true, but because the mind adjusts. It adapts. It finds equilibrium with the new information. This is what the mind is built to do when you let it. It processes, it integrates, it recalibrates, but you have to let it. And letting it means not interfering with the process by running from it. One of the most common forms of avoidance is not the dramatic kind. It is not the person who refuses to open a letter or who walks out of a difficult conversation. Those are visible forms, and most people recognize them, at least in others. The most common form of avoidance is subtle. It looks like overthinking. It looks like analysis. It looks like being busy. When you spend 3 hours researching a decision that your gut already knows the answer to, that is avoidance dressed up as diligence. When you have the same conversation with 5 different people, seeking opinions you do not actually need, that is avoidance disguised as thoroughness. When you rearrange your plans for the 10th time, telling yourself you are optimizing, that is avoidance masquerading as strategy. The common thread is motion without progress. You are moving, but you are not moving toward the truth. You are moving around it. And the mind will let you do this indefinitely. It does not have a built-in alarm that says, "You are avoiding something." It will happily support your endless circling as long as the circling keeps you away from the source of discomfort. This is why external awareness is unreliable for breaking avoidance. You cannot think your way out of a pattern that your thinking is actively maintaining. You have to shift from thinking to observing. You have to step back from the stream of thoughts and watch what is happening rather than participating in it. When you observe your own mind, you start to notice patterns you could not see from inside them. You notice that certain topics, cause your attention to scatter. You notice that specific thoughts are followed by an immediate urge to do something, anything, that changes the subject. You notice that your energy drops when you get close to a particular truth, as if your body is trying to shut down the process before it reaches a conclusion. These are not random events. They are signals. They mark the location of the truths you are avoiding. And once you learn to read them, you have a map. Not a map that tells you what to do. A map that tells you where to look, where the real work is waiting. The identity you carry plays a central role in what you are willing to face. Every person holds a set of beliefs about who they are. These beliefs form a kind of internal structure, a framework that organizes experience and gives it meaning. You believe you are a certain kind of person. You believe you hold certain values. You believe your past choices were made for good reasons. This structure is not truth. It is interpretation. But it feels like truth because it has been in place for so long that you cannot distinguish between the structure and the reality it describes. When an uncomfortable truth threatens this structure, the mind does not treat it as new information. It treats it as a threat. If you believe you are responsible and disciplined, and you encounter evidence that you have been avoiding your responsibilities, the mind does not calmly integrate this information. It fights it. It minimizes it. It generates excuses, justifications, alternative explanations, anything to preserve the existing structure. This is not vanity. It is architecture. The mind protects its framework because the framework is what allows it to function. Without a coherent sense of self, decision-making becomes chaotic. Every choice requires a return to first principles. There is no shortcut, no baseline, no stable ground to operate from. So the mind protects the structure, even when the structure is built on inaccurate beliefs, even when maintaining it requires ignoring reality. And this is where the deepest form of avoidance lies. Not in the refusal to see facts, but in the refusal to update beliefs about yourself. You can acknowledge a fact without letting it change you. People do this constantly. They say, "Yes, I know I should exercise more." They say, "Yes, I know that relationship is not working." They say, "Yes, I know I have been putting this off." The acknowledgement is there, but the identity remains unchanged. They still see themselves as the person who will get to it eventually. The person who is basically fine. The person whose situation is different, more complex, more nuanced than it appears from the outside. This is acknowledgement without integration. It satisfies the surface need to feel honest without requiring any actual change. True confrontation with truth requires more than acknowledgement. It requires you to let the truth reshape how you see yourself, to let it dismantle the parts of your self-image that are not supported by evidence, to let it reveal that some of your decisions were not wise, some of your beliefs were not accurate, and some of your patterns are not serving you. That process is uncomfortable in a way that goes beyond ordinary discomfort. It touches something foundational. It asks you to be uncertain about who you are. And uncertainty, for most people, is more frightening than failure. Failure at least preserves the structure. You can fail and still maintain your self-image by blaming external factors. But genuine self-examination removes that option. It turns the lens inward and asks, what if the problem is not the situation? What if the problem is the way I have been responding to the situation? That question, asked honestly, can be transformative. But it can only be asked by someone willing to tolerate the answer. There is a pattern that avoidance follows, And once you see it, you will recognize it everywhere. It begins with a signal. Something in your environment or your internal experience triggers a recognition. You notice something that does not align with the story. You are telling yourself. Maybe it is a comment someone makes that lands differently than it should. Maybe it is a result you achieved that does not match the effort you claimed to put in. Maybe it is a feeling that arises when you are alone and the distractions fall away. The signal is brief. It arrives without fanfare. It does not announce itself as important. It just appears, a quiet data point that conflicts with your existing narrative. What happens next is the critical moment. In most cases, the mind immediately generates a response, not a considered response, an automatic one. It finds a reason to dismiss the signal. It categorizes it as irrelevant, as an exception, as noise, and then it moves on. It returns to the comfortable narrative. It resumes the regularly scheduled programming. This entire sequence, signal, dismissal, return to comfort, happens below the level of conscious awareness for most people. They do not experience it as a choice. They experience it as nothing happening at all. But something did happen. A truth tried to reach them, and they rejected it without examination. This is the mechanism of avoidance in its purest form. It is not dramatic. It is not visible. It is just a quiet, repeated pattern of turning away from information that threatens the existing structure. And every time it happens, the structure becomes a little more rigid, a little more resistant to change, a little more disconnected from reality. The cost of this rigidity is not immediately apparent. It reveals itself over time, in the slow divergence between what you believe and what is actually happening. You believe the relationship is fine, but the distance between you and the other person grows wider each month. You believe your work is progressing, but your results plateau and then decline. You believe you are handling your stress, but your sleep deteriorates, your patience thins, your ability to concentrate narrows. These are not sudden collapses. They are gradual erosions. And they are invisible to the person experiencing them precisely because avoidance has prevented the honest accounting that would make them visible. By the time the divergence becomes undeniable, the gap between belief and reality is so wide that closing it feels overwhelming. And so the avoidance deepens. The mind doubles down on its protective strategies, not because they are working, but because the alternative, full confrontation with accumulated reality, feels worse than continued denial. This is the trap, and it is a trap that tightens the longer you remain inside it. But it follows a predictable pattern. And anything that follows a predictable pattern can be interrupted. The interruption does not have to be dramatic. It does not require a crisis or a breakdown or a moment of revelation. It can begin with something as simple as pausing. Pausing before you dismiss the signal. Pausing before you reach for the distraction. Pausing before you tell yourself the comfortable explanation. In that pause, there is space. And in that space, the truth has room to be heard. Not welcomed, not celebrated, just heard. Allowed to exist for a moment without being immediately rejected. This is the beginning of a different relationship with truth, not a fearless one, not a comfortable one, just a slightly more honest one, and from that slight increase in honesty, everything else becomes possible. Managing the internal tension that arises when you face an uncomfortable truth is a skill. It is not a personality trait. It is not something you are born with or without. It is a capacity that develops through practice. The tension itself is not the problem. Tension is information, It tells you that something important is happening, that your mind is processing a conflict between what it believes and what it is encountering. The problem is what you do with the tension. Most people treat internal tension as a signal to act immediately. They feel the discomfort and they move. They make a decision, start a task, initiate a conversation, or withdraw from one. The movement is not strategic. It is reactive. Its purpose is not to resolve the issue, but to discharge the tension. And once the tension is discharged, the motivation to address the underlying issue evaporates. You feel better. The urgency passes. The truth retreats back into the background. This cycle of tension, reactive movement, and relief is one of the most efficient avoidance mechanisms the mind employs. It gives you the feeling of having done something without requiring you to do the thing that actually matters. Learning to sit with tension without acting on it immediately is one of the most difficult and most valuable skills you can develop. It does not mean passivity. It does not mean doing nothing indefinitely. It means creating a deliberate delay between the feeling and the response. A space where you can observe the tension, identify what it is pointing to, and then choose a response based on understanding rather than reactivity. That delay changes everything. When you act from reactivity, your decisions are shaped by the desire to escape discomfort. When you act from understanding, your decisions are shaped by the reality of the situation. These lead to very different outcomes. The reactive decision often feels right in the moment, but creates problems later. The considered decision often feels uncomfortable in the moment, but resolves problems over time. This is the trade-off that avoidance prevents you from seeing. By moving too quickly, you never discover that the discomfort of facing truth is temporary, but the consequences of avoiding it are cumulative. There is another layer to how avoidance shapes behavior that is worth examining closely. Avoidance does not only affect the specific truth you are avoiding. It affects your general capacity for honesty. Every act of avoidance makes the next act of avoidance easier. It trains the mind to default to comfort seeking. It weakens the internal mechanism that detects and responds to reality. Over time, this creates a person who is not deliberately dishonest, but who has lost the ability to be fully honest. They are not lying to themselves in any conscious sense. They have simply allowed the habit of avoidance to erode their connection to what is real. This erosion is gradual and often invisible to the person experiencing it, but it is visible to others. People around you can often see the truths you are avoiding long before you can. They see the patterns you cannot see, the inconsistencies you have normalized, the gaps between what you say and what you do. This is why honest feedback from others can feel so jarring. It is not that they are telling you something new. They are telling you something you already know, but have trained yourself not to see. The discomfort of receiving that feedback is not the discomfort of new information. It is the discomfort of having your avoidance exposed, of having the protective structure challenged by someone who is not inside it with you. And the natural response to that exposure is to defend the structure, to explain, to justify, to reframe, to find a reason why the other person is wrong, uninformed, or biased. Sometimes they are, but the speed with which you dismiss their observation is usually a better indicator of its accuracy than any rational analysis you perform in response. The faster you reject feedback, the more likely it is touching something real. This is a useful principle to remember. Your resistance is often the most reliable compass you have. It points directly at the truths you most need to face. Not every resistance points to avoidance, of course. Sometimes you reject information because it genuinely is inaccurate. But there is a qualitative difference between calm disagreement and defensive rejection. Calm disagreement does not carry emotional charge. It does not generate urgency. It does not produce the need to immediately prove the other person wrong. Defensive rejection does all of these things. It creates a felt sense of threat that is disproportionate to the content of what was said. And that disproportionality is the marker. It tells you that the response is not about the information. It is about the structure being protected. When you notice that marker in yourself, you have an opportunity. Not to automatically accept whatever was said, but to slow down. To examine why the reaction was so strong. To ask what would have to be true about you for the feedback to be accurate. That question is one of the most powerful tools available for breaking through avoidance, not because it forces you to agree with every criticism, but because it forces you to consider the possibility that your self-image has blind spots. And it does. Everyone's does. The question is not whether you have blind spots, but whether you are willing to look for them. The way avoidance affects decision making is worth understanding in detail, because decisions are where avoidance becomes most costly. Every decision you make is based on a model of reality. That model includes your understanding of the situation, your assessment of the options, and your prediction of the likely outcomes. When you are avoiding a truth, your model of reality is incomplete. It has a gap where the avoided information should be, and decisions made from an incomplete model are, by definition, less accurate than decisions made from a complete one. You might make a career decision without acknowledging that the path you are choosing is motivated by fear rather than interest. You might make a financial decision without factoring in a debt you have been ignoring. You might make a relationship decision without addressing the dissatisfaction you have been suppressing. In each case, the decision feels rational within the model you are operating from. But the model itself is distorted, and so the decision, while internally consistent, is externally misaligned. This is why people sometimes look back on their choices and wonder how they could have been so blind. They were not blind. They were seeing clearly within a framework that was missing crucial information. Information they had access to but chose not to incorporate. The quality of your decisions is directly proportional to the accuracy of your model, and the accuracy of your model is directly proportional to your willingness to include uncomfortable truths in it. This is not a complicated principle, but it is one that most people violate consistently, not because they do not understand it, but because including uncomfortable truths requires tolerating the discomfort they produce. And tolerating discomfort, as we have established, is a skill most people have not developed. So they make decisions from incomplete models, and then they wonder why the outcomes do not match their expectations. The mismatch between expectations and outcomes is one of the clearest signs that avoidance is active. When reality consistently fails to match what you predicted, it is worth asking not whether the world is being unfair, but whether your predictions were based on a reality you were willing to see rather than the reality that actually exists. This kind of self-inquiry is not self-punishment. It is not about blaming yourself for every bad outcome. It is about recognizing that your perception of reality is not the same as reality itself, and that the gap between the two is often filled by avoidance. Closing that gap does not guarantee good outcomes, but it dramatically improves the odds. And over time, it builds a kind of practical wisdom that cannot be acquired any other way, not through reading, not through advice, not through observation, only through the direct experience of facing what is true and integrating it into how you operate. And this is where clarity becomes possible. Clarity is not the absence of confusion. It is the willingness to see things as they are, even when what they are is uncomfortable. It is the ability to hold multiple truths at once, some pleasant and some unpleasant, without collapsing into denial or despair. People who possess clarity do not have easier lives. They do not encounter fewer problems. They simply encounter problems as they actually are, rather than as they wish them to be. And this gives them a significant advantage in responding effectively. When you see a problem clearly, your response can be precise. When you see it through the distortion of avoidance, your response is imprecise, often addressing the wrong aspect of the situation or missing the point entirely. This precision is what separates effective action from busy action. It is the difference between solving a problem and managing the symptoms of a problem you refuse to diagnose. Effective action requires accurate diagnosis. Accurate diagnosis requires honest observation. And honest observation requires the willingness to see what is actually there, not what you want to be there. Each of these steps is simple in concept and difficult in practice. Not because the steps themselves are complex, but because each one asks you to tolerate a little more discomfort than the last. The willingness to tolerate that discomfort is what determines whether you live in alignment with reality or in a comfortable fiction that gradually diverges from it. There is a particular form of avoidance that operates in relationships, and it deserves attention because its effects are so widespread and so damaging. In relationships of any kind, romantic, familial, professional, there are truths that both parties sense, but neither addresses. These are the elephants in the room, the topics that are carefully skirted, the questions that are never asked because both sides suspect the answers would be uncomfortable. This mutual avoidance creates a kind of shared fiction. Both people agree, without ever explicitly agreeing, to pretend that certain things are not happening, and for a while, the fiction holds. The relationship continues. The surface remains smooth. But beneath the surface, the avoided truths are doing their work. They are creating resentment, distance, confusion, and mistrust. Not because the truths themselves are necessarily destructive, but because the act of avoiding them introduces dishonesty into the relationship. And dishonesty, even the unspoken kind, corrodes trust. People in relationships that suffer from mutual avoidance often report a feeling of disconnection that they cannot explain. Everything looks fine from the outside. The conversations are pleasant. The routines are maintained, but something essential is missing. What is missing is reality. The relationship has become a performance rather than a genuine connection. Both parties are managing their presentation rather than being present. And the gap between the performance and the reality creates a sense of emptiness that no amount of pleasant interaction can fill. Addressing this does not require dramatic confrontation. It does not require listing grievances or assigning blame. It requires something much simpler and much harder, the willingness to say what is true. Not in anger, not in accusation, just in honest observation. I have noticed that we avoid talking about this. I feel like there is something between us that we are not addressing. I want to be honest about something I have been holding back. These statements are not complex. but they require an enormous amount of courage, because they violate the unspoken agreement to maintain the fiction. They introduce truth into a space that has been carefully insulated from it. And the response to that introduction is unpredictable. The other person might welcome it. They might resist it. They might meet your honesty with their own, or retreat further into avoidance. You cannot control their response, but you can control whether you continue participating in a shared fiction or whether you offer the relationship the respect of honesty. Relationships built on truth are not always more comfortable than relationships built on avoidance, but they are more real, and real connections, even imperfect ones, provide something that fictions never can: a genuine sense of being known. Being known requires being seen, and being seen requires showing what is actually there, not just the curated version you have assembled for presentation. This is frightening for most people because they have been trained to believe that the unedited version of themselves is not acceptable, that the parts they hide are the parts that would cause rejection. But more often than not, the parts they hide are the parts that would create connection. Because vulnerability, genuine vulnerability, not performed vulnerability, signals trust. And trust is the foundation of every meaningful relationship. Avoidance undermines this at every level. It prevents vulnerability by protecting the curated image. It prevents trust by introducing dishonesty. It prevents connection by substituting performance for presence. And so the relationship, despite appearing functional, slowly drains of meaning. Breaking this pattern does not require overhauling the relationship overnight. It requires small acts of truth-telling, practiced consistently, that gradually replace the habit of avoidance with the habit of honesty. Each truth told is a brick removed from the wall between you and reality. And as the wall thins, the connection deepens. There is a specific way that avoidance interacts with ambition and personal growth that is worth understanding. Many people who consider themselves ambitious are, in practice, avoiding the truths that would make their ambition effective. They set goals without examining whether those goals are actually their own or borrowed from someone else's expectations. They pursue achievement without asking whether the achievement will satisfy the need that is driving them. They work hard on tasks that feel productive without questioning whether the tasks are moving them toward anything meaningful. This is a sophisticated form of avoidance because it is cloaked in effort. The person appears engaged, driven, committed. But beneath the activity, there is a truth that remains unexamined, the question of whether any of this is actually what they want. This question is one of the most commonly avoided truths in the lives of high-functioning individuals, because examining it carries an enormous risk. If the answer is no, if the path they have invested years in is not the right one, the implications are staggering. They would have to confront wasted time. They would have to revise their identity. They would have to face the people who supported their previous direction and explain the change. They would have to start, in some sense, from scratch. And so they do not ask the question. They continue working. They continue achieving. They continue accumulating results that look impressive from the outside, but feel hollow from within. This hollowness is not a sign of depression or ingratitude. It is a sign of misalignment. The person's actions are not aligned with their actual values, desires, or needs. And the avoidance of the question that would reveal this misalignment is what keeps them locked in a pattern that serves their image, but not their life. Confronting this truth does not necessarily require abandoning everything. Sometimes the adjustment is small, a shift in emphasis, a change in approach, a reprioritization that brings the work back into alignment with what actually matters. But even a small adjustment requires the willingness to look honestly at the gap between what you are doing and what you actually want. And that willingness, once again, is blocked by the discomfort avoidance is designed to prevent. The internal experience of facing truth consistently is not what most people imagine it to be. People who have not practiced it tend to imagine that facing truth is a dramatic, wrenching experience. They picture tears, sleepless nights, existential crisis. Sometimes it is, but more often it is quiet. It is a moment of stillness where something settles into place, a recognition that arrives without fanfare and sits calmly in your awareness, waiting for you to decide what to do with it. The drama that people associate with truth telling is usually not produced by the truth itself. It is produced by the accumulated tension of years of avoidance finally releasing. It is the backlog of suppressed reality breaking through all at once. When truth is faced regularly, in small doses, as a matter of routine rather than crisis, the experience is very different. It is like a minor adjustment rather than a major overhaul, a slight correction in direction rather than a sudden reversal. This is the advantage of building the habit of honest self-assessment. Not that it eliminates discomfort, but that it distributes discomfort over time in manageable increments, rather than allowing it to accumulate into an overwhelming mass. People who practice this do not appear to be suffering. They appear calm, grounded, clear. Not because they have avoided the hard work, but because they have distributed it so evenly that it never reaches a critical threshold. From the outside, this looks like natural composure. From the inside, it is the result of countless small acts of honesty, each one slightly uncomfortable, each one slightly strengthening the capacity to face what is real. This is what discipline looks like when it is applied to the mind rather than to behavior. Behavioral discipline is about controlling what you do. Mental discipline is about controlling what you are willing to see, and the second form is far more fundamental than the first, because what you do is always downstream from what you see. If your perception of reality is distorted by avoidance, no amount of behavioral discipline will compensate. You will be disciplined in the execution of a flawed plan, consistent in the pursuit of the wrong objective, efficient in the management of a life that is not aligned with what you actually need. Mental discipline corrects the perception first. It ensures that the plan you are executing is based on accurate information, that the objective you are pursuing is genuinely yours, that the life you are managing is one you would choose if you were being fully honest. This does not mean that mental discipline replaces behavioral discipline. Both are necessary. But mental discipline is the foundation. Without it, behavioral discipline is just organized avoidance. The relationship between attention and avoidance is worth examining carefully. Where you place your attention determines what you perceive, and what you perceive determines the model of reality you operate from. Avoidance works primarily by redirecting attention. When an uncomfortable truth begins to surface, the mind does not argue with it. It does not present counter evidence. It simply moves your attention elsewhere. It gives you something else to focus on, something that does not carry the same discomfort. This redirection is so smooth and so rapid that it does not feel like a choice. It feels like natural curiosity, like your attention simply drifted to something more interesting or more urgent. But if you observe closely, you will notice that the drift is not random. It has a direction. It always moves away from discomfort and toward safety. And the things it moves toward are not necessarily important. They are just less threatening. This is why people often find themselves absorbed in trivial tasks when they have something important to deal with. The mind is not choosing the trivial task because it is valuable. It is choosing it because it is safe. Reclaiming your attention from this pattern requires the same kind of pause we discussed earlier. When you notice your attention drifting, instead of following it, you stop. You ask where it was before the drift occurred. You trace it back to the point of departure. Often, what you find at that point is exactly the truth you need to face. This practice of tracing attention back to its origin is deceptively simple. It requires no special skill, no training, no equipment, just the willingness to follow the thread backward and see where it breaks. The break point is the truth. The drift is the avoidance. And every time you trace it back and sit with what you find, you strengthen a mental pathway that makes the next instance of avoidance a little less automatic. Over time, this changes the fundamental relationship between you and your own mind. Instead of being carried by the current of your attention, you become the observer of it. You watch where it goes. You notice when it tries to flee. You gently redirect it back to where it needs to be. This is not meditation, though it shares some qualities with it. This is practical mental discipline, applied to the specific challenge of avoidance. It is a targeted intervention aimed at the mechanism that prevents you from seeing clearly. And it works, not immediately, not perfectly, but consistently enough that the cumulative effect, over weeks and months, is a genuine increase in the clarity and accuracy of your perception. There is a way that avoidance interacts with fear that deserves careful attention. Fear and avoidance are often treated as the same thing, but they are not. Fear is a response to perceived threat. Avoidance is a strategy for managing that response. You can feel fear without engaging in avoidance, and you can engage in avoidance without consciously feeling fear. These are separate experiences that frequently occur but do not require each other. This distinction matters because it changes how you address the problem. If you treat avoidance as fear, you try to overcome the fear. You try to be brave. You try to push through. And sometimes this works. But often it does not, because the avoidance is not always driven by fear in the way you would recognize it. Sometimes avoidance is driven by preference. You prefer the current state over the effort required to change it. Sometimes it is driven by habit. You have been avoiding this particular truth for so long that the avoidance has become automatic, disconnected from any conscious emotional experience. Sometimes it is driven by convenience. Facing the truth would require time, energy, and disruption that you do not want to deal with right now. In each of these cases, the solution is not courage. It is honesty. Not the courage to face a threatening situation, but the honesty to admit that you are choosing comfort over reality. That admission does not have to be public. It does not have to involve anyone else. It just has to be internal. A quiet acknowledgement to yourself that you are aware of the truth and that you are choosing not to address it. Even this small act of internal honesty changes the dynamic. Because once you acknowledge that avoidance is a choice rather than a necessity, you reclaim the ability to make a different choice. You may not make a different choice immediately, but the awareness that you could is a fundamental shift from the belief that you cannot. And from that shift, change becomes possible. Not inevitable, but possible. And possibility is all that is needed to begin. There is a quality that people who consistently face truth develop over time, and it is not what you might expect. It is not toughness, it is not fearlessness, it is not unwavering confidence, it is steadiness. They become steady, not rigid, not immovable, just stable in a way that allows them to encounter difficult realities without being destabilized by them. This steadiness comes from repeated exposure to discomfort, followed by the discovery that the discomfort passes. Each time they face a truth and survive it, their confidence in their ability to handle the next one grows slightly. Not the kind of confidence that announces itself, not bravado or certainty, a quieter kind, the kind that simply does not flinch as readily. And this steadiness becomes self-reinforcing, because the steadier you become, the less threatening truth appears. And the less threatening truth appears, the less avoidance your mind generates in response to it. Eventually, the relationship with truth shifts from adversarial to neutral. Truth is no longer the enemy to be avoided. It is simply information to be processed. Sometimes pleasant, sometimes unpleasant, but always useful. This neutrality toward truth is one of the most valuable mental states a person can develop. Not because it eliminates discomfort, but because it removes the secondary layer of suffering that avoidance creates. The primary discomfort of truth is unavoidable. When something is wrong, knowing it is wrong does not feel good. But the secondary suffering, the anxiety of avoidance, the tension of maintaining a fiction, the energy cost of constantly monitoring and redirecting attention, this is entirely optional. And it is this secondary suffering that constitutes the majority of the pain associated with uncomfortable truths. The truth itself is usually manageable. The avoidance of it is what becomes unbearable. When you develop neutrality toward truth, you eliminate the secondary suffering. You are left with only the primary discomfort, which is smaller, shorter, lived, and far more manageable than you imagined while you were spending all your energy trying to avoid it. This realization, that most of the pain you associate with facing truth is actually the pain of avoiding it, is one of the most liberating discoveries available to anyone willing to test it. But it cannot be understood intellectually. It has to be experienced. You have to actually face a truth you have been avoiding and discover, through direct experience, that the facing was less painful than the avoiding. Once you have had that experience, it becomes a reference point, a piece of evidence that your mind cannot dismiss, because it was generated by your own direct encounter with reality. And each subsequent experience reinforces the reference point, building a growing body of evidence that truth, while uncomfortable, is survivable, and that avoidance, while comfortable, is costly. This evidence accumulates quietly. It does not produce dramatic transformations. It produces gradual recalibrations. Small shifts in how you respond to discomfort, slight increases in how long you can sit with uncertainty before reacting. These shifts are individually unremarkable, but collectively, over time, they produce a person who operates from a fundamentally different relationship with reality. Not a perfect relationship, not a fearless one, just a more honest one. And that honesty, compounded over months and years, creates advantages in every domain of life. In decision-making, because the model of reality you operate from is more accurate. In relationships, because the connections you build are based on truth rather than performance. In personal growth, because the goals you pursue are aligned with what you actually value rather than what you have been afraid to question. In resilience, because your capacity to absorb difficult information without being destabilized has been strengthened through practice. In clarity, because the mental energy previously consumed by avoidance has been freed up for productive use. These are not abstract benefits. They are practical, observable, and measurable in the quality of the life they produce. And they are available to anyone willing to start with the smallest possible act of honesty, noticing the next truth they want to avoid and choosing, just for a moment, to stay with it instead of turning away. There is a subtle mechanism the mind uses to maintain avoidance that operates at the level of language. The words you use to describe your situation to yourself are not neutral. They are selected, often unconsciously, to support the narrative that avoidance has constructed. When you say, "I am waiting for the right time," you are using language that frames inaction as strategic patience. When you say, "It is complicated," you are using language that makes the situation seem too nuanced for simple honesty. When you say, "I will deal with it when I am ready," you are using language that positions avoidance as a form of self-care. None of these phrases are lies in the traditional sense. They are half-truths, accurate enough to avoid the feeling of dishonesty, but incomplete enough to avoid the discomfort of the full picture. This linguistic self-management is remarkably effective because it operates at the level of how you frame reality rather than what you see. You do not have to deny the truth if you can describe it in terms that make avoidance seem reasonable. Paying attention to the language you use when you talk to yourself about difficult situations is one of the most efficient ways to detect avoidance. Not because the language is always deceptive, but because the patterns in your language reveal the patterns in your thinking. If you consistently describe your avoidance using the language of patience, wisdom, or complexity, it is worth examining whether those descriptions are accurate or whether they are serving a protective function. The test is simple. Ask yourself whether the language you are using would change if you replaced the desire for comfort with the desire for accuracy. Would waiting for the right time become voiding the discomfort of acting now? Would it is complicated become I do not want to face the simplicity of what needs to happen? Would I will deal with it when I am ready become I am hoping this resolves itself so I never have to deal with it? If the translation changes the meaning significantly, your original language was not describing reality. It was managing your experience of reality. And managing your experience is not the same as understanding your situation. This is not about being harsh with yourself. It is about being precise. Precision in your internal language leads to precision in your perception. And precision in your perception leads to better decisions. The mind prefers comfortable language because comfortable language preserves the existing structure. But precise language, even when it is uncomfortable, builds a more accurate map, and a more accurate map leads to a more effective life. There is something important to understand about the relationship between avoidance and time. Time does not heal avoidance, it deepens it. The common belief that things will get better with time is true for grief, for certain kinds of emotional pain, for the processing of experiences that have already been faced. Time allows integration. Time allows perspective. Time allows the emotional intensity of an experience to diminish as the mind assimilates it. But none of this applies to avoided truths. Because avoided truths have not been faced. They have not been processed. They have not been allowed to enter the integrative machinery of the mind. They sit, untouched, in the space where they first appeared, and they do not diminish with time. They fester. The financial problem you avoided 5 years ago is not smaller now. It is larger. The conversation you needed to have 3 years ago has not become easier. It has become more loaded with accumulated tension. The pattern of behavior you noticed in yourself a decade ago has not corrected itself. It has become more entrenched. Time is not your ally when it comes to avoidance. It is your adversary. Every day you wait, the truth becomes more difficult to face. Not because the truth itself has changed, but because the gap between reality and your perception of reality has widened, and bridging that gap becomes more painful the wider it gets. This is why early confrontation, while less comfortable than continued avoidance, is always less costly in the long run. The discomfort of facing a small truth today is trivial compared to the discomfort of facing the compounded consequences of that truth 5 years from now. But the mind does not process long-term cost well. It operates on immediate feedback. And the immediate feedback of avoidance is relief. The immediate feedback of confrontation is discomfort. So the mind chooses avoidance. And the debt grows. Understanding this dynamic does not automatically change it, but it provides a framework for making a different choice. When you feel the pull of avoidance, you can remind yourself, not with dramatic urgency, but with calm clarity, that the cost of delay is real, and that it increases with every day that passes. This reminder does not have to be motivational. It does not have to be inspiring. It just has to be accurate. And accuracy, when it is truly absorbed, has a way of shifting behavior that inspiration cannot match. There is a common misconception about people who seem to face truth easily. From the outside, they appear to have a natural comfort with discomfort. They seem unfazed by difficult realities. They make hard decisions with apparent ease. They address problems directly, without the hesitation and circling that characterize avoidance. But this appearance is misleading. These people are not comfortable with discomfort. They have simply had more practice tolerating it. The difference is not one of temperament. It is one of experience. They have faced enough uncomfortable truths that their tolerance for the associated discomfort has increased. Their threshold is higher. Their recovery is faster. Their confidence in their ability to handle the experience is stronger. But the discomfort itself is still there. They still feel it. They still notice the pull of avoidance. They still experience the temptation to look away. What has changed is not the presence of the discomfort, but their response to it. They have learned, through repetition, that the discomfort is temporary, and that the clarity on the other side is worth the passage through it. This learning cannot be shortcut. You cannot read about it and acquire it. You cannot observe it in others and absorb it. You have to go through it yourself. You have to face a truth, feel the discomfort, survive it, and register the result. And then you have to do it again and again, until the pattern is established firmly enough that it begins to compete with the avoidance reflex. This is not quick. It is not dramatic. It is slow, incremental, and often unremarkable. But it is the only process that actually works. Everything else, reading about self-improvement, thinking about change, planning to be more honest, is preparation. The actual work happens in the moment when the truth appears, and you choose to stay with it instead of turning away. That choice, made repeatedly, is what transforms your relationship with reality. There is a particular danger in partial truth. Telling that is worth addressing. Some people develop a pattern of facing certain truths while carefully avoiding others. They are honest about their professional shortcomings, but not about their emotional patterns. They confront their financial reality, but not the reality of their relationships. They acknowledge their surface level flaws while protecting their deeper blind spots. This selective honesty creates the illusion of self-awareness while preserving the core structure of avoidance. The person feels honest because they have faced some truths. They believe they have done the work. They point to the areas where they have been courageous as evidence that they are not in denial. But the truths they continue to avoid are often the most consequential ones. The ones they face are often the ones that carry the least threat to their identity. This is not hypocrisy. It is the natural behavior of a mind that is trying to maintain as much of its existing structure as possible while appearing to engage in honest self-examination. Detecting this pattern in yourself requires a specific kind of attention. Instead of asking, "Where have I been honest?" you have to ask, "Where have I not been honest?" Instead of cataloging the truths you have faced, you have to search for the ones you have not. This is harder than it sounds, because the truths you are avoiding are, by definition, the ones your attention naturally moves away from. Finding them requires deliberately directing your attention toward the uncomfortable spaces, rather than away from them. It requires asking the questions you least want to answer. What am I most afraid to be wrong about? Where do I most resist feedback? What topic makes me most defensive? What aspect of my life do I most avoid examining? The answers to these questions point directly at the truths you are most deeply avoiding. And those truths, precisely because they are the most protected, are usually the most important. They are the ones whose acknowledgement would produce the greatest shift in how you see yourself and how you operate. They are the truths with the highest return on honesty. And they are the truths you are least likely to face without deliberate, sustained effort. The practice of deliberately seeking out your most protected avoidances is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be. It is the mental equivalent of exploring the parts of a building that have been closed off and locked. There are reasons they were locked, and opening them may reveal things that are difficult to process. But the alternative, leaving them locked indefinitely, is not a neutral choice. It is a choice that shapes everything you do, everything you decide, everything you become. Because the truths behind those locked doors do not disappear. They influence your behavior from the shadows. They shape your decisions without your awareness. They create patterns you cannot explain and reactions you cannot control. Facing them does not eliminate their influence, but it transforms it. Instead of being controlled by something you cannot see, you gain the ability to respond to something you can. And that transformation, from unconscious influence to conscious response, is the essence of mental freedom. Not freedom from discomfort. Freedom from being controlled by your avoidance of discomfort. As we draw this to a close, there is something essential to sit with. Truth will always exist. You cannot escape it. You cannot outlast it. You cannot outmaneuver it. It will be there when you wake up in the morning and when you lie down at night. It will be there in the conversations you have and the ones you avoid. It will be there in the results you achieve and the results you fail to achieve. It is constant, patient, and indifferent to your feelings about it. But acting as if it does not exist, is optional. You can choose to face it or to avoid it, and you make that choice, consciously or unconsciously, dozens of times every day. Those who develop clarity over time share quiet patterns that are easy to miss because they do not announce themselves. They notice avoidance early, not always immediately, not perfectly, but sooner than they used to. They have developed a sensitivity to the internal signals that mark the beginning of the avoidance process, the slight tension, the subtle redirection of attention, the impulse to reach for a distraction. They pause before reacting, not for long, sometimes just for a breath. But that pause is enough to create the space between the signal and the response, enough to allow a choice where there used to be only reflex. They face discomfort instead of fleeing, not with dramatic resolve, not with gritted teeth and clenched fists, with quiet willingness, the willingness to let the discomfort exist without immediately trying to fix it, escape it, or explain it away. They make decisions aligned with reality, not with the version of reality that makes them feel best, but with the version that is most accurate. They incorporate uncomfortable information into their models rather than filtering it out. They update their plans when new truths emerge rather than defending plans that have been invalidated. None of these patterns are extraordinary. None of them require exceptional talent or unusual personality traits. They are ordinary behaviors, available to anyone, that produce extraordinary results when practiced consistently over time. The results are not sudden. They accumulate gradually, like interest compounding in an account you rarely check. And one day, you look up and realize that the quality of your decisions has improved, that your relationships are more genuine, that your sense of direction is clearer, that the internal noise that used to consume so much of your energy has quieted, not disappeared. Quieted, because truth does not eliminate complexity. It simply allows you to engage with complexity honestly, without the added burden of maintaining a fiction. Over time, this builds stronger clarity, the kind that does not waver when circumstances change, the kind that does not depend on external validation, the kind that holds up under pressure because it is built on reality rather than on the fragile scaffolding of avoidance. It builds sharper decision-making, not because you become smarter, but because you become more accurate. Your models improve. Your predictions align more closely with outcomes. Your plans account for factors you previously refused to acknowledge, and it builds greater control over behavior, not through willpower alone, but through alignment. When your actions are based on an accurate understanding of reality, they do not require constant correction. They flow from clear perception to effective response without the friction that avoidance introduces. This is not a transformation that happens once. It is a practice that continues for as long as you choose to maintain it. And the choice is made fresh every day, in every moment where truth appears and asks for your attention. The next time a truth appears that you want to ignore, there will be a brief moment before your mind moves away. A fraction of a second where the truth is visible, where the discomfort is present, where the avoidance has not yet kicked in. Most people move too quickly to notice it. Their attention is redirected before they even register that something was there. They pass through the moment without awareness, carried by a reflex they have never examined. But once you recognize that moment, you gain the ability to choose awareness instead of denial. You gain access to a decision point that was previously invisible, and at that decision point, you can do something that changes everything. You can stay. Not forever, not with perfect composure, just for a moment longer than you usually do. Long enough to see the truth. Long enough to feel the discomfort. Long enough to discover that neither one will destroy you. That is all it takes. One moment of willingness, repeated over and over, until the willingness becomes a habit, and the habit becomes a way of seeing the world. Because control does not come from ignoring truth. It comes from deciding what to do when it appears.